see you got a graphic with the Super El Nino up there, and we haven't really talked a lot about this, Tim. I think we briefly brushed on this, but I know I'm like you. We're pretty avid on social media. Follow a lot of great long range forecasters. There's a pretty significant. I mean, I've never seen such a consensus in the climate models and the long range guidance for such a strong El Nino this far out. But it's like 100% certainty of a strong El Nino. You just don't see that very often.
You really don't. And I was, doing a little digging for, what we could be looking at for hurricane season. So I was curious about the El Nino stats. And they categorize these things in a couple ways. And if you're not a meteorologist, I wouldn't expect you to know these thresholds, but the area of water near the Pacific Ocean equator off of South America, when that's a half degree above average, that's when they classify it as an El Nino. It's got to be that way for a 3-month period. So it's not there yet. We're not technically in an El Nino yet, but it's developing. And the odds of it developing are so high, about 80-90% into the middle of the summer and toward fall. They call it a very strong one when it's 2 degrees or higher in Celsius. And this has only happened a couple times. Most recently in 2015, 2016, it got up to 2.75, which as far as I could tell is the highest. This year, the forecast is pushing it close to 3 as like a model consensus. 3 degrees above average. And so that is something I just wonder what the impacts will be. We know typically fewer hurricanes. We also know typically in an El Nino winter, you might cash in on some precipitation. But if you haven't seen something like that before, maybe it would be a little bit different. I don't know your thoughts about this. Ben Knoll put out a cool graphic about this today on Twitter that I was looking at for rainfall for our area.
Yeah, and I mean, typically for us in the cool season, it's wet and cool. But you're right. Sometimes these really extreme events like Super El Ninos or even really strong La Niñas, they don't always play by the rules, Tim. Sometimes they do weird things because of how strong they are. And what's really interesting to me is from a global standpoint, outside of climate change, we know the planet is warming, but when you have that much warm water in the equatorial Pacific, Tim, it's naturally going to warm the climate as a whole. So you would think there's a pretty high probability from a global temperature standpoint that if this thing becomes a very strong or super El Nino, that the global temperatures for the next 6-12 months could be all-time highs, because that's just going to warm the atmosphere as a whole, especially as that ocean water transfers to the atmosphere.
Yeah, you're so right. And so across the globe, this could mean more heat, more drought, more things like that. What we were just showing you on the screen, though, that was the impact of a strong El Nino between November and January, specifically as it relates to precipitation. So we might be in big trouble between now and then. But there is a pretty strong signal that when you have these stronger El Nino events, we tend to have a more active jet stream in the south, and it tends to mean more rainfall. Maybe not as much snowfall, and that's what we would talk about later on, I guess. Maybe week by week in the wintertime there. But that would be at least an encouraging sign, if it were to pan out, that hopefully there's a light at the end of the tunnel eventually. It might just be hard to get there.
Which probably makes water restrictions more important, because and you're probably saying, well, why would we need water restrictions? We know rain's coming. Well, if we can water restrict now, that will help us get through the summer, knowing that down the road we're going to reverse this pattern. So we got to stretch the water supply right now. It's like rationing, right? Hey, we're going to get something down the road, but we get to ration now to stretch our current water. Speaking of the winter, and a lot of times, Tim, when I talk about our winter forecast and people get excited for El Nino because typically it means cool and wet, we should caution people that cool and wet doesn't always mean snow. Sometimes it's a lot of cold rains, which is a pretty typical setup for the Carolinas. So you always got to be careful. That doesn't mean always snow. It could be a lot of 40-degree rains, which are pretty common in El Nino winters around here.
The cooler can just mean more cloudy and more, wet and just not as much sunshine. It doesn't necessarily mean more Arctic outbreaks. At all. I certainly remember growing up in the Northeast, right, or people that go skiing up there or anything, they hate to see an El Nino coming. That doesn't mean that they're going to have a lot of Arctic air coming up that way. It means they're probably going to get a lot less snow, which to some people is good news and to others is bad news. It depends on your persuasion.